Hello, everyone. And today, our presentation is sort of a deep dive into what is considered in some circles a taboo topic, which is death transits in astrology. So, this might be a little bit thick or heavy for some of you who are newer to astrology, but I'm going to roll it out in a way that hopefully makes sense to those of you who aren't real familiar with some of the stuff I'll be talking about. And of course, you have this video. So if you are going to dive into your chart after you finish watching it, you can go back and reflect on the notes that I did put into the PowerPoint presentation for all of you. So let's just jump right into it. All right, let's share my screen. All right. And let's pull her on up. All right, so death transits in astrology. There are lots of different modalities of astrology, just like magic. You know, I'm omnistic and my practice is omnistic, but I work and know lots of practitioners who are Hellenistic, who are Goetic, who are Asatru. So there are lots of different pathways in magic. The same holds true in astrology. You may work with astrologers who specialize in medieval or harmonics, Vedic, Placidius. So this really kind of applies to all modalities. And I do recommend that if you are going to be diving into death transits, that you look at multiple modalities for correlations. So taking your Placidius charts and looking at the correspondences in your D9 and also your second harmonics. That's just something that I personally do. Of course, you may, have a different formula. There's no wrong formula, but at the end of the day, you do want some correlating data. So let's jump into it. Okay, so yes, death can sometimes be predicted to the day. And I've seen that myself several times, but I do want to emphasize the term sometimes. Death transits can work out in all sorts of interesting ways. So even despite death transits, modern medicine can step in to save many a death. There is this example I use. It is of a man whose chart demonstrated several of the classic transits of death, all colluding on the same date. So that deadly date did arrive, and he did proceed to have heart failure and did die. However, he was resuscitated by a medical team using the latest and medical advanced equipment, and he went on to live a long life and even won a bunch of awards in his field. So take everything that you're learning today. Don't go overboard with it. When we talk about death transits, I think that's why it's kind of taboo. People kind of fixate and they get worked up. So always know that lots of different things can happen. Now, there are those who believe that your time of death is immutable. And I do think that is true in some cases, but certainly not all cases. The Hindu idea seems more realistic that karma and destiny is fixed for some individuals. That's true. But there are others that it's more flexible for. And there's all sorts of cases that fall in between. So the question, of course, remains, should we as astrologers predict death? To predict death does seem unethical in some cases. Could be, and that's for a lot of reasons. You, an astrologer, might see in a chart what you think may be death, but you might want to keep that, cheek in tongue or tongue in cheek, whatever that saying is, because you don't want to frighten people unnecessarily either. So there are those rare cases that you are going to be asked about death or the general time of death. And if it is a situation where it's for somebody who is terminally ill, if it's a hospice worker or a death doula, these transits and these reports can be very beneficial for individuals in those situations. But again, this is very personal. This is a matter between you, your client, and their God, whatever God represents to them, and your own conscience. So I don't judge anyone. You have to make the decision at the end of the day. So you are going to be armed with some knowledge here that could potentially forestall what otherwise would be a death or serious illness. But like anything else in life, sometimes it's a matter of forewarned is forearmed, right? It's like a preventative medicine. It's like an immunization. Sometimes when I'm looking at astrology, I do look at it as a preventative measure, knowing what's coming up energetically, what sort of planetary influences I'm going to be dealing with. I can plan for that. Just like if I'm traveling overseas and I know they have a malaria outbreak, I can plan for that, right? It's just all about planning. I would never suggest to a client that's having issues. The example I used here was like, say, severe bowel troubles that death looks imminent because of their transits. I would rather encourage them to, hey, why don't you go in and get that exploratory colonoscopy done right away? Or give them some advice that gets them to take action. And again, this is very personal. This is up to you as an individual and as an astrologer. But I am going to break down 25 of the what I consider most important aspects that do occur near the death of an individual. Now, normally there are several correspondences of death that are required, and you do need to look at background progressions. Those need to agree as well. And later on in this presentation, I'll actually even break down some more ways you can validate and confirm the information you're seeing. You don't want to just pull your Placidius and say, oh, look. You need to go and correlate that data with transits and progressions and, Vedic and evolutionary aspects. You need to look at a pattern. I would even go as far as saying looking at spouses and children's charts to validate the death of a loved one. And we'll get into that later in the presentation, but always make sure you're validating, right? So now you will notice that most of the fatal transits are from planets, nodes, and eclipses to the natal sun, moon, or ascendant. And this is because the degrees of these three natural points are the givers of life. You'll see that reference to, especially in medical astrology, as anaretic degrees. If you're familiar with that term, it's okay if you're not. Most frequently occurring death aspects are from the transiting malefics and or eclipses and hard aspects or quincunx, which is 150 degrees, to these three life points. Now, again, I just want to strongly kind of remind you that you, your friends, your family, you're all going to experience all of these following transits multiple times in a lifetime without dying. So I don't want you to think, oh my God, Saturn is conjunct my sun, therefore I'm about to die. That's not how it works. It takes several strong aspects to cook the goose, astrologically speaking. So these aspects are most useful really when you are charting a terminal illness, someone who is, at the extremity of old age, they're in their 90s. Again, situational factors, right? You need to kind of look at all of that. All right, so the first 5 I'm breaking down here. Number 1, transit Saturn conjunct or opposing the natal sun within a few degrees. Saturn usually makes this pass 3 times and is most potent or powerful when in retrograde or stationary. Number 2, transit Saturn square the natal sun. Now that is weaker than number 1, but it does play a part. It does have some potency there. Number 3, an eclipse within 1 degree of the natal sun. Now, the south node near the sun is more powerful than the north node. One of the nodes is always near the eclipse point. The eclipse date is not necessarily the event date because the eclipse effect can span 3 to 12 months kind of waiting to hatch, quote unquote. And what will happen is it'll become triggered by other transits following the eclipse. So you look for dates like the transit sun or Mars. If it's arriving by conjunction, square, or opposition to the degree of the eclipse, that would be an important date, right? An event date. Transiting south node crossing the natal sun weakens vitality. Number 4, an eclipse within 1 degree of the natal moon. So the south node style eclipse near the moon is much more negative than the north node type eclipse near the moon. So always keep that in mind. Transiting south node crossing the natal moon exhausts the native. Who is the native? Whoever's chart you're reading. Is it your chart? You're the native. Is it your mom's chart? Your mom's the native. It is exhausting, okay? The eclipse date, again, is not necessarily the event date. You got to look at when, that 3 to 12 month hatching period when there can be that trigger. So that can be triggered by transits, within that landscape, that year landscape, specifically transit Sun or Mars, arriving by conjunction, square, or opposition to the degree of the eclipse. All right, number 5, natal ascendant ruler transiting the 8th house and conjunct a malefic. Again, these are the 25 big ones. And it takes more than one, you guys. So I sometimes get nervous when I roll this information out because I don't want anybody to get, carried away with it. All right. Number 6, transit Saturn in quincunx. Again, remember 150 degrees of natal sun, moon, or ascendant by 1 degree. These orbs are important, you guys. So make sure you're looking at that. Number 7, transit Saturn transiting through the 8th sign of the birth map, 8th house, counting from the ascendant as 1 counterclockwise. Number 8, I know some of this is heady if you're newer to astrology. If you're not, you're understanding the language. I will break it down a little bit more in this presentation. I just wanted to kind of put them out there so that you had them in front of you and we can dive in a little bit deeper later. Number 8, transit Saturn crossing the natal south lunar node. Number 9, transit Saturn crossing the descendant point. Now that's the point opposite the ascendant, of course. Now, of the 4 angles, the descendant is the most death-oriented. As the preeminent life timing device, Saturn is frequently seen transiting any one of those 4 natal angles at the time of death, including the descendant. So, Saturn crossing an angle marks an important life juncture, and this is kind of how I'm breaking it down for you. This is, again, meat and potatoes, you guys. I'm kind of skipping the potatoes and just giving you the meat. The ascendant, when we see Saturn crossing that angle, that's usually the old life ending and a new life chapter beginning. The nadir, that's endings, of course. The descendant is like a setting. It's a pause point in life. It's a point where the sun sets, of course. And the midheaven, that's your achievement point, your finalization of accomplishment, the peak. So kind of keep that in mind too when you're looking at death transits or trying to come up with a death axis with a chart. Number 10. Now, I could do a whole series on medical astrology, and I don't want to get into that today, but I'm going to throw a couple little things out there. So there are, each planet has a disease group association, and Jupiter is usually associated with liver and obesity problems. There's a lot there, but I'm keeping it simple for you guys today. I didn't want to overload you. I feel like this is very thick information and I don't want to throw too much at you at one time. But number 10, for Jupiterian diseases, when Jupiter is squaring or opposing the sun, it can be an especially dangerous time period. Now, should the ascendant specifically be Virgo or Capricorn and the native, so that's whoever's chart you're analyzing, suffers from any Jupiterian complaint, then the period of Jupiter's transit passage through these signs is considered quite dangerous. So keep that in mind. Again, liver, obesity. I think I might break down some Jupiter stuff in a later slide here. All right, the next batch of 5 here, Jupiter transiting the 8th sign from the ascendant, counting again counterclockwise. You're going to count the ascendant sign as 1. Number 12, transit Jupiter quincunx the natal sun within 1 degree. So this is dangerous if the sun simultaneously receives a conjunction, square, opposition, or quincunx aspect of Saturn, or a conjunction or square from the south node. Again, lots of angles you need to look at here. Number 13, transit Jupiter quincunx of the natal moon within 1 degree. So this is dangerous in lunar diseases, or if the moon is what we call heilig. Again, this kind of goes into medieval astrology, medical astrology, but you want to observe if the moon simultaneously receives kind of a dangerous aspect from transit Saturn or the south node also. A note I did put here, transit Jupiter is really more problematic for Virgo, Gemini, and Capricorn ascendants. Also, this transit has a significant effect on the mental health, placing the mind under unusual strain. So number 13 specifically, this could correlate potentially to things like drug overdose, suicide, um, things of that nature, kind of FYI. It's not always just Uranus, you guys. Jupiter can expand stuff too. Okay, so number 14, for Virgo, Capricorn, or Gemini ascendants, the passage of transit Jupiter over the ascendant can be dangerous if the native suffers from a Jupiter-related ailment like diabetes, liver problems, or obesity. Number 15, transiting Jupiter conjunct the natal south lunar node. All right, our next grouping of five. All right, so number 16. So Jupiter, now remember, Jupiter expands everything, right? It is our greatest benefic. I believe it's our greatest benefic, is often seen transiting a natal angle at the time of death. Now, because Jupiter is thought to govern the spirit body, could this transit bring release? In a lot of charts I've looked at post death, I have seen that. I have seen Jupiter transiting that natal angle. And I believe the reason that occurs is because of spiritual release at that time. Now, there's not a whole lot written about that. There hasn't been a whole lot of study, but that is my belief. Number 17, a south node style eclipse occurring within 3 degrees over the birth ascending degree. Again, I know this is heady for some of you, so just stick with me. Number 18, transit Mars conjunct or oppose the natal sun. This transit is more powerful in retrograde or stationary. The square is also dangerous if that individual is already ill. Number 19, transit Mars conjunct or oppose the natal moon. Most powerful when retrograde or stationary, and the square again is also dangerous. Number 20 is transit Mars conjunct the natal south mode or node, sorry, mode. It is kind of a mode, isn't it? But node. Last 5 here I want to talk about. Number 21, transit Mars in a close quincunx to natal sun, moon, or ascending degree. Number 22, you knew Uranus, Uranus had to make a show here, right? So Uranus is involved in sudden, unexpected death, often seen in close conjunction with Jupiter, either lunar node or the lights, which is the sun or moon. Uranus, again, is one of those, I think, of drownings, fires, car accidents, plane crashes, electrical deaths, things of that nature. Number 23, exact or close conjunctions of transiting Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto with each other's natal positions is very frequent. That's a frequent find when you're looking at charts. Number 24, the nodal return and the nodal reverse are fairly common transits at the time of death. And then number 25, again, the Heilig, usually the natal sun or moon, positioned in what's called the bends or between the transiting nodes exactly. Again, if you study medieval astrology, if you're familiar with some of the medical astrology terms I'm using, this will make sense. If not, I definitely recommend diving into that because it's very interesting and it makes a lot of sense and you'll find a lot of correlations in other systems. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more. This is more about death axis information. So the 4th, 8th, and 12th houses are particularly relevant to trauma as they relate to emotional foundations, transformation, and hidden challenges. I gotta take a sip, guys. Hang on. Now, there are 3 houses of endings, the 8th, 4th, and the 12th. The 12th house is usually that house of confinement, right? Commonly referred to as the house of secrets, sorrows, self-undoing. I actually love the 12th house, but it gets a bad rap. Confinement can mean a lot of things too, not just, it could be hospitals, asylums, jails, monasteries, convents, hiding places, among many others. There's lots of ways to interpret that. So when we're looking at death transits or we're trying to identify a death axis point, we're going to be evaluating those houses. We do look at the condition of the planets, especially in the 12th house and the rulership of the 12th house. Now, that's not it though. You want to look at the fourth house for another condition of death. For example, here, a water sign in the fourth house might mean a death on or near the water or a body of water. Now, if it's in Scorpio, it might be a swamp or a sewer, right? Because you got to start making these correlations. If Taurus was on the fourth and Venus was placed in it, I would actually expect a peaceful death and probably a pleasant place. So you want to consider the signs on the cusps as well as the planets too. You want to look for insidious aspects, I guess is a good word to explain it, forming between pernicious planets, particularly Pluto, Neptune, Saturn, and Mars. If you find them, then you should be checking for upcoming eclipses. Where they hit in a chart and the aspects that they make can be those trigger points we were talking about. You also want to look at the progressed moon because the progressed moon also does the same thing. So I've said it once, I've said it a million times. There are three planets I never like to see squaring off with each other, and that's Pluto, Saturn, and Mars. Okay, nothing good can come from that usually, unless we're like intentionally trying to set off a volcano or something like a nuclear bomb. You need to take a much harder look if they are in fixed signs or the angles of the chart. So that's going to be important too. And I cut off the last of this. Let me move this so you guys have it. Hang on. Move out of the way. These little boxes, why is it so hard? Okay, there we go. Okay, so take a much harder look if they are in fixed signs or the angles of the chart. I like to personally calculate the Saturn-Pluto midpoint and look for any aspects to it. Of course, do what works best for you, but that's just a good kind of foundational start. Look for any difficult aspects to Uranus, especially if aspected by the moon's nodes or Saturn. Mars can trigger an accident there. So be aware of that. Mercury will be involved, if there's travel. So Mercury will be part of the picture if travel is involved, like a travel accident. Uranus can easily indicate a sudden death, such as a heart attack or a stroke. Uranus is usually there in unexpected or earlier than expected deaths. I would look further into the chart if one of the heavy hitters, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, the moon's nodes, were crossing the ascendant. Paying more attention if the conjunction received difficult aspects from any of these heavy hitters, right? You want to make sure you're looking at all that. I would take note of what kind of aspects, if any, the natal, progressed, and directed sun was receiving. Again, I'm just giving you a lot of tools for the toolbox here. If you're a death doula, if you're a caregiver, and you're also an astrologist, this is good information, right? Good ways to evaluate the situation for your loved one. So I would take a good look at the aspects to the ruler of the ascendant. Don't ever overlook the sixth house of health, and its cusp in particular. Pay attention to what's happening to the planets in the sixth and to the ruler of the sixth. Transiting Saturn is often, again, on the ascendant of death charts in the case of illness. So Jupiter, surprise, surprise, is often on the ascendant of death charts in the cases of accidents involving travel, and in those whose death is sort of a relief or a welcome release. So somebody who's been suffering. It can show up also on the ascendant of one who's going to inherit. So say, for example, I am doing a death chart on somebody who's terminally ill, and I'm looking at their spouse's chart to validate a time frame of when this individual may pass. I may see that even in their spouse's chart because of that. So just kind of, again, another FYI to make correlations and correspondences to kind of validate and confirm time frames. If I found many of the aspects mentioned here in a single chart, or some of the aspects mentioned here in combination with other things in the chart that painted a sinister picture, then I would look for similar aspects, again, in the progressed and directed charts, going through the entire checklist in each one of them. You want to be sure. I would look for more confirmation in both the solar and lunar returns around the suspected date. And then I would even break it down to daily age harmonics. Those should further confirm a smaller range of time. But when I start a death chart, I do want to tell you guys, I start with the D9, the second harmonics, and their Placidius. That's where I start, and it grows from there. I mean, I've done mid-tree Uranian charts or midpoint charts, and then I will look at spouse and children. Like if I am pretty certain that I know the date, I want that validation. So, in conclusion, here, I would just warn those who are looking for death in the charts, remember that there are aspects for every event, but there are not always events for every aspect. So, don't get carried away or paranoid. Okay. It's so easy to do that. You got to keep things in perspective, right? So, it is generally considered unethical for astrologers to predict death. But first and foremost, the reason for that is because we could be wrong, right? Imagine the impact on the person if we're wrong. So I think astrology is a fairly precise science, but interpretation depends on the skill and the experience of the astrologer. Okay, so keep that in mind. Death doesn't usually stand out in a person's chart unless it's imminent. Otherwise, you usually have to go searching for it. And it is a lot of work and it is a lot of time. It is not easy. It's not something you can sit down in an afternoon and do. Okay. It takes time to make these correlations. While it is unethical to predict a client's death, there are rare exceptions to the rule to every rule. So, in the case when a client has been diagnosed as terminally ill, they probably do have important businesses to take care of before they go. Things might include like saying goodbye to loved ones, burying the hatchet with old enemies, taking care of karma, right? Taking care of finances, finding homes for children or pets, fulfilling a bucket list. So, in that case, you would be doing the client a favor if you could give them maybe a small window of time. But again, that's your own personal choice. Everybody has to make that decision. Um, but I can see again, like I do death charts for death doulas who I work with, and for hospice workers. There has been a couple of clients I've worked with over the years where a parent was in almost a death stage, but they just would not let go. And, we not only looked at the charts to see what they were holding on to, but when they might actually, let go of that tether. So, I mean, because the kids were suffering, the kids were suffering at that point, and so, I mean, you have to kind of evaluate each situation and see if it makes sense to you to do a death chart. So the death axis, there are no. I know if you use Google, please be careful with Google and some of these shady ass websites. There is no specific death axis per se. So the cause and circumstances of a person's death are as unique and individual as his birth, right? It's going to be a unique chart. There are many contributing factors. And when it comes to the chart, every picture tells a story, right? So using JFK Jr. as an example, that was an interesting chart because along with a snapshot of death, it showed traveling and it showed a wedding, it showed an event, like a happy event. So all these things showed in his chart at the same time. So, traveling, a wedding, all these things going on, and then boom, death right there in the mix of it. So, I mean, it's very unique. You could be death transits can be buried in other transits too that are creating other things. So, one thing we want to check for is if we think we have the date pinned down. Of course, again, I'm beating this to death. Is confirmation in the charts, sorry, of the client's spouse, children, parents, or other close relatives if we can get their data. Because if it's not in those, then it's not likely, unless they're not going to learn about the death till later on. And I've seen this a couple times. So while the unknown death may not show up in the relatives' charts until a later time, maybe days, weeks, months, or years, it should show up in all of them. Because in our modern times, bad news travels fast, and that's true. So if I'm looking at, if a wife is about to die and I'm not seeing it in her husband's chart or her young children's charts, I'm going to guess I'm wrong about that time of death, because it should be showing. That grieving should be showing. So keep that in mind. There's always exceptions, right? Yes, there's always exceptions. If the news of the death does not reach one of those in the group whose charts are tested, it could be because that person is away and unreachable. It's all part of that person's story, and it can be used still to narrow the timing down. There's usually some clues, but we can't jump to conclusions if we see that one or two aspects are forming. Okay, it's going to take a lot more than that. So, again, don't ever jump the gun on death dates, you guys. Okay, so I suppose if someone were going to label an axis or axis, I'm not good with that word, as the death axis, they might be talking about the second house, eighth house axis. Hang on one second. I gotta take a sip. I am dry today. It is so dry in Minneapolis. I don't know what's going on, but my hair is even dry. I put oil on it and everything, and it's like still crazy. Hang on. All right, because everyone thinks of the eighth house as the house of death, right? But it's so many other things. It's regeneration, sex, surgery, insurance, shared money, public support, crime. I could go on, right? So we don't freak out if our sun enters the eighth house because it's done that at least once a year since our birth, right? So the second house is included in the axis almost by default because it's the house opposite the eighth, thus the term axis. And the second house is the eighth house of one's spouse. So we don't talk about that a whole lot. So the second house is really going to represent the eighth. Oh, so the second house is the eighth house of one's spouse. So that's the eighth house aspects of your spouse. Say that 3 times fast, you guys. That's why I got to type all this out because if I was just talking and then I was tripping over my tongue, you guys would be like, I don't even have a translator for what she's trying to say. But it's on screen, so you have it. Um, so it is true that often the eighth house or its ruler shows up in a death chart. That is true. Things that might stand out are the moon's nodes, again, the nodes across it, or maybe one of the more pernicious planets conjunct or squaring it. So we do look at planets in the eighth or any afflictions to the ruler of the eighth. That's the other thing. A tip here, the natal sun in the eighth house is often prominent in the charts of those who become more famous after their death. Often, but not always. So I'm using a victim here as an example, Nicole Brown Smith. That was true for her. Actually, it's true for many, but I'm using her as an example. Other tips here. Just as likely to be a death axis is the ascendant descendant axis. So this is because the ascendant not only represents the physical body, but can also act as a bullseye of sorts, okay? So whatever is laid out in the stars to happen will do so to you, quote unquote, at this time and in this place, right? That's the old saying in astrology. And so the opposite, the seventh house cusp, is representative of the place where the sun sets on life. So when you're doing these evaluations, these are all aspects you're going to kind of be using to paint your picture. The wheres, the whens, the hows. Also likely to be prominent in a death chart are the midheaven, which is the 10th, and the fourth house cusps. So the 10th, a planet in the 10th or the ruler of the 10th might be afflicted in the death chart of someone famous or one whose death will become famous or infamous. I always think murder. Missing person cases. It's true. The fourth house represents early beginnings and final endings, among other things as well. So again, all of this is just formula. I'm giving you guys formula. When you're looking at the chart, I would play around with your own chart. Why not? Unless that's going to freak you out. Or pick somebody who's already dead, a famous person, and play around with that chart. But these are just formula points. I'm giving you different formula points to start to learn how to look for these different correspondences and correlations. And that's it. I want to thank you guys for your support. As always, let me close this out. So I know that's a heavy topic. That's a little bit taboo, but it is spooky season. It's not just Mabon and Soen. I love Halloween, and I thought, what better presentation could I do in September to prep people for October, that Halloween fun, than death transits, right? So this was very heady, very formula based, but I basically wanted to give you kind of a jumping platform to start playing around with charts and seeing what you uncover. Like what kind of equations jump out at you, what formulas work well for you, which systems work well for you. Like I told you what systems I use, different systems might work better for you. Do you just like Uranian astrology? Are you going to be just looking at that midpoint tree and that's going to be it? Make sure that's not the case. A lot of people who are familiar with Uranian astrology, when they're doing death transits or death reports for their clients, if you work with death doulas, they will jump to that Uranian mid tree. But here's the thing, you need to validate that with, again, look at harmonics, look at Placidius, look at Vedic, look at this individual's, if you can get at least a spouse or a child or some other chart going for correlating factors. I mean, really look at the progressions, look at the returns. You really want to beat this bush to death. In astrology, sometimes we can rush through and if we're just doing synastry or whatever, if we're doing Fideria, but death transits, death reporting, don't ever rush through. You really need to take your time and beat that bush to death, so to speak, because again, if you were going to be sharing that information with another person, just think of the impact. So you don't want to create any issues or mental health problems. So just keep that in mind. But it's fun. It's fun to play around with. Again, I would suggest, I looked at death charts for family members that have already passed just to test my theories and my formulas. That's something you could do. I would recommend. There's no harm, no foul there because, you know, they're already passed. So, anyways, I hope you enjoyed this presentation and stay magical.